All right, welcome to Let's Talk About Things. I'm Jonathan Reutenberg, and this is part two of the series I'm doing on why executions are declining across the United States. In the last episode, we talked about the 23 and maybe 24 states that have the 23 states that have abolished capital punishment altogether, and they might be joined by Nevada later this year. We did hear that the state Senate Judiciary Committee chairwoman says that she wants to hear from the governor, who has expressed reservations about outlawing capital punishment. So we will ultimately have to see what ends up happening. But this episode, I would like to talk about the middle category of states, which Nevada is actually part of. It's the states that have the death penalty but don't perform executions, either with a form of moratorium or because they just haven't done executions in a while. And we're going to see a big reason why that has been the case in many states. So I'm just going to share my screen and I'll show you what I'm talking about. And you may notice that we are back on the Wikipedia page and we are looking at a different part. It's the places where executions have just stopped. And you notice there's a different map right over here. I don't know if you can see all of it. Hopefully you can see most of it. The states that have abolished capital punishment altogether, 23 of them, they're in green. States with a formal moratorium are in blue, and states that just haven't done an execution in a while are in yellow. Those are the states we're going to talk about in this episode. And the states in red have conducted an execution in the last 10 years and still have capital punishment. We will talk about those in the final episode. But let's talk about the states that are in that middle category. There's, there are different reasons why executions have not been performed. California, Oregon, and Pennsylvania, for example, have been under a moratorium that has been imposed by the governors of those states. Governor Tom Wolf in Pennsylvania, Kate Brown in Oregon, in California, and Gavin Newsom. Those governors have either imposed or maintained moratoria in those states, and you can see the dates that they were imposed. Oregon was imposed and was the first to impose in 2011, then Pennsylvania 2015, and then California in 2019 is the most recent. I believe that all three of these governors, possibly with the exception of Tom Wolf, are on record. I believe at least two of the three, and possibly all three, are on record as opposing capital punishment. But for whatever reason, they haven't been able to abolish it. Case of Pennsylvania, the Republicans control the legislature, and there's been no movement on bills like that. California, they've tried, but the voters have actually voted to retain it in several elections, the most recent being 2016. And the Constitution is explicitly amended to say that it's not unconstitutional. So that can create a disconnect between what lawmakers and what voters want, and it can show how emotional the issue is. To give an example, there have been several referendums and ballot initiatives that have taken place on the issue of capital punishment. Not one of them since 1976 has resulted in capital punishment being abolished. Every single one of them either resulted in it being retained or some sort of like expedition of appeals. There's not been a single ballot measure that has passed that has limited or abolished capital punishment, which can speak to how emotional the issue can be for some people. In fact, polls do say that around 53 to 55% of Americans support capital punishment, but when you ask them whether they prefer capital punishment or life in prison without parole for crimes including murder, they will overwhelmingly say this. We're talking like a 60 to 40 margin. They'll say that they prefer life in prison without parole. So the issue can be nuanced, but it can be emotional sometimes. But a lot of these states are on this list because of one reason, and that is lethal injection. Kentucky and Montana, for example, have had their lethal injection protocols suspended by the courts, and the legislatures there have just not been able to pass a measure to replace the protocol and allow for executions to restart. Montana in particular has only two people on death row. Their last execution was in 2006, and they have actually not handed down a single death sentence in the entirety of the 21st century. So since the turn of the century, not a single death sentence has been handed down, which is remarkable because it's actually the trial judge in Montana that hands down the sentence as opposed to other states where it's the jury. So the fact that the judges have opted not to impose a death sentence in the 21st century is remarkable. So we'll have to see what ultimately happens there. A bill to replace the protocol and allow for any substance to cause death to be adopted was rejected by the state house. So or by one of it passed one of the chambers, but I believe it failed in the other. So at least for now, Montana will not be restarting executions. But it leads us to the main reason, why a lot of these states have not been able to conduct executions, and that is because they rely on lethal injection. Lethal injection is the method du jour of executing people. It became popular starting in the 1980s, and has largely supplanted the use of other things like the electric chair and the firing squad. In fact, every jurisdiction, that includes the 27 states and the federal government that still practice capital punishment, all of them rely mainly on lethal injection. Some of them do have backup methods, but it's the primary method in every jurisdiction. And I guess rather than creating a supposedly more humane way to execute someone, it has opened up a new line of ways to limit the death penalty by several actors. For example, drug manufacturers in the U.S. And abroad have been finding out that their drugs have been used in executions, and they have stopped selling them to states that have the death penalty for that reason. In fact, in Europe, the European Union has banned the exportation of death-inducing drugs to the United States because of the use of capital punishment there. So states have not been able to procure the drugs that they need, and because the makers won't sell it to them. That is one of the reasons why states like Louisiana and Indiana have not been able to execute people, because they just don't have the drugs. In fact, in Indiana, they fought to keep the source of their drugs secret, but the courts have now ruled against them. The same thing, by the way, just happened a few months ago in Idaho, which has not conducted an execution since 2012. They will also have to reveal the source of their drugs. And what's been people have been finding out is that in the wake of instead of being able to purchase them from approved FDA sources, they're basically purchasing them from less regulated compound pharmacies, or from abroad, from other countries, or illegally. This is what happened in Arizona. There's suggestions that the government has tried to keep the costs of execution, of purchasing the drugs for executions, off the books. But it's been coming up in an investigative research. Arizona and Oklahoma had to stop executions because they were not able to procure the drugs, and they had botched executions famously in the mid 2010s. Both states now believe that they have gotten hold of the drugs that they needed, and they think that they can resume executions possibly this year. But we will ultimately have to see about that. And that is, and the other thing, by the way, is that physicians do not participate in executions, and of course they don't, because it would be unethical for them to do so. They are bound by the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm, and executions serve no medical purpose and do cause harm. So basically, for that reason, legitimate pharmacies and physicians do not participate in executions, which is why in North Carolina, because that's a requirement under state law, they have not been able to conduct executions since 2015. And it's also why, by the way, Ohio, they, like Indiana and Louisiana, they have not been able to procure the drugs that they need either. And the governor has basically just suspended executions until he says that he's not in favor of abolishing it. He says that he just wants the legislature to adopt a new method of execution that is not lethal injection. And that is where I think a lot of states are going. But in Ohio doesn't seem to be a priority, so executions will probably not resume for a while. But in states like South Carolina and other states, that has been a priority. It looks like they're going to adopt the electric chair, and they might also adopt the firing squad as an alternative to lethal injection, which they have not been able to carry out since 2011. That's another state which could very well resume executions if this bill passes that could adopt the electric chair and the firing squad as a backup method if the lethal injection becomes impossible to do. In fact, other states have provisions like this, including some like Tennessee, Oklahoma, and Utah, which have adopted them in the last few years because of the inability to procure the drugs for lethal injection. Now, other states like Mississippi, there's other reasons why they may not perform executions, and I'm going to talk about that in a later episode. But Mississippi for a long time had, I'll talk about it now. Mississippi had for a long time, poor counties were not able to afford defense attorneys' fees, which has led to execution, death sentences being overturned based on inadequate assistance of counsel, and which is a requirement under the Fifth or Sixth Amendments. And basically, if you can't afford an attorney and the state doesn't provide one to you, you cannot adequately defend yourself. So that is why Mississippi has been slower to execute people than other states. But I'll talk about that more in a later episode. But there are other states, like for example, the military just hasn't conducted an execution in a long time, even though they still have the death penalty on the books. Kansas has not abolished the death penalty in 1973, readopted it in 1994, but they have not executed anyone in that time. I believe they have about 7-10 people on death row at this point. They just haven't executed anyone since 1965. Utah has not executed anyone since 2010, and I believe that they have not handed down a death sentence since 2008. They have there has been bills to abolish the death penalty in the past few years. Hasn't passed legislature yet. I think it's passed one house in the past, but I think that they need to get it. I don't know. They didn't try again this year. They might next year. We'll have to keep an eye on that. Wyoming has not executed anyone since 1992. They had only one execution since death penalty was reinstated in 1977. In fact, they currently have no one on death row. They are the only state with the death penalty that has no one on death row at the moment. I've talked about how Montana has only 2 people on death row. South Dakota, which has conducted an execution in the past couple of years, they only have 1 person left on death row, as does New Hampshire, which has abolished the death penalty, like I said in the previous episode, but they still have someone on death row who could still be executed. And finally, there's the American Samoa. Well, actually, not finally, but there is the American Samoa territory, which has not formally abolished it, but they don't have a method of execution on the books. So the other territories have abolished it. This one hasn't formally, but effectively, they don't execute anyone. Nevada has also not conducted an execution since 2006, but it's not because there's a moratorium on the books. They do have 70 people on death row, but they just haven't conducted an execution in the past 15 years. Although they might later this year. And there's not, like I said, there's an ongoing debate in Nevada about whether or not to abolish capital punishment. That could very well, if it does get abolished, it might prevent an execution from taking place later this year, because one could very well take place in June, especially if the death penalty is retained. So that's why it's all the more important that lawmakers, are able to. It's passed the state assembly, but lawmakers in the state senate need to get it out of committee. There's a deadline in 15 days from now, on the 14th of May, to get it out of committee, and then the following Friday they have to get it past the state senate and onto the governor's desk. The governor, Steve Sisolak, has expressed misgivings about the effort. He's not sure about whether or not he wants to abolish it in all cases, but we'll have to ultimately see what happens with that state, because they could very well be the next state to abolish the death penalty if everything, if the efforts ultimately pan out. But anyway, this is a discussion of the middle category of states that have not conducted executions but still have the death penalty on the books. Thank you so much for watching this. Subscribe if you like it. In the next episode, in the final episode, I want to talk about the states that have conducted executions and talk about why, despite the efforts of lawmakers in some states, and for the most part, executions have been declining even in those states, even in states that have performed them as recently as last year. So I'll like to talk about that in a later episode. And until then, have a great rest of the day, and I will see you then.